So welcome to Chapter 6. In Chapter 6, we're going to pick up where we left off. In Chapter 5, we were talking about ATP and what ATP was as a molecule. And in Chapter 6, what we're going to talk about is how cells make ATP. So that's the process of cellular respiration. And we're taking a step back from that, fantastic thing that we could see cells, and we're back into the world of biochemistry. So a lot of this stuff feels a little more abstract because we can't actually see it happening, in our lab. But we have talked about how cells do require energy and what they use energy for. And so we know that it's the energy that's necessary for life that we're talking about here. And really what we're going to talk about is how we take the energy, the potential energy that's stored in chemical bonds in organic molecules, and specifically glucose molecules, and all the potential energy stored in that molecule, and convert it into usable energy, and how it gets converted ideally into ATP. And that's really the overarching concept that we're going to be looking at with this chapter. There is the second half of this crash course, and there's also, it was used in the chapter 5 as well, but you can use that as an additional resource. I'll put other good resources on the Moodle page as well, because this can be considered a fairly complicated topic. I'm going to do my best to kind of break it down for us. This is the overview of things that we're going to talk about in chapter 6. We're going to talk about how cellular respiration is an exergonic process. So that was where we were going from a high amount of potential energy to a low amount of potential energy. It was akin to burning of fossil fuels or the wood in my wood stove. And what we're doing is transferring energy from the bonds of glucose into ATP, which is why I put that little note on the first slide of this PowerPoint. Cellular respiration is going to make 32 ATP molecules from each molecule of glucose. And this is a number that has changed. Between the printings of our textbook, it has actually been altered by a number of ATP molecules. And so this is an example how science is still a process and it's still evolving as a body of knowledge. We're going to divide respiration into 3 stages, and these were in your pre-reading. So we'll talk about glycolysis, we'll talk about the Krebs cycle, and we'll talk about our citric acid cycle, and we'll talk about oxidative phosphorylation. An oxidative phosphorylation had 2 components. It had the electron transport chain, and it had chemiosmosis. After we're done those 3 stages of respiration, we're going to talk about aerobic and anaerobic respiration, so one that uses oxygen and one that happens without oxygen, and how your cells can still derive ATP without any oxygen available. And we're also going to talk about the interconnectedness of all of this. So other foods can go in and derive ATP through the process of cellular respiration, and it is that interconnection. So there's always breaking down molecules to make the ATP, but there's also the process on a cellular level of synthesis and building up bigger molecules from those monomers. Ultimately, we've talked about this before, all the energy has come from the sun that you're going to eat. So there is a connection between photosynthesis and respiration. We are not covering photosynthesis in this course. That's chapter 7, because humans don't photosynthesize, but they are the reverse of each other. And that was something that we noticed at the end of the chapter 5. So photosynthesis goes one way, and respiration would go the other. Or if you wanted to say respiration's going forward and photosynthesis, regardless, they are the reverse of each other. So that's what this is illustrating, in that, the top part here is photosynthesis and the bottom part is respiration, and they're linked in this way. So energy's needed, just as a reminder from chapter 5, why we need that energy for growth, transport, making of molecules or the driving of chemical reactions, movement or translocation or locomotion, and the reproduction of cells. We talk about it as respiration, and it is linked to your respiratory system. We're going to talk about your respiratory system in the second half of this course. So the respiratory system is, your process of breathing, and also on a cellular level, what's happening in your muscles here. And so this is where we're talking about cellular respiration. An example of a muscle that would have a lot of cellular respiration going on would be your muscle cells. And so this is cellular respiration. Oh, it says it right there. But it is part of your respiratory system, which involves your lungs and the breathing part. So we'll see this on both levels in this first half of the course, where we're talking about teeny tiny, and then in the second half of the course, where we start talking about the organism as a whole and those different organ systems in a body. So it is an example of a chemical reaction, and it really takes glucose and oxygen molecules and combines them, and these are the high energy, right? There's lots of energy stored up in the bonds, and then this would be a lower energy, and the energy difference is in ATP and some heat. So cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide and water, and we're going to use this as a guide. We want to make sure, as we're understanding cellular respiration, we've accounted for all of these components that go in and out of chemical or out of cellular respiration. So photosynthesis is the reverse. I've already said it. We've got it being an exergonic process that releases chemical energy. Oxygen is used as glucose is broken down, and it produces carbon dioxide and water, and the cell captures the energy released as the molecule of ATP, storing that energy between the second and third phosphate groups of the ATP molecule. And we talked about in chapter 5 how ATP becomes ADP to release that energy. Now, it's not as efficient as you might think. If we were to take one molecule of glucose and talk about how much energy is actually contained in the bonds of glucose, cellular respiration only takes about a third of the energy that is stored in glucose as potential energy to capture into ATP. The remainder is released as heat, which is why, when you are consuming more energy or more glucose, you're doing more work, you get hot as a human, right? All right, so we'll come back to that one again. The energy is measured in kilocalories. So on, say, food packaging and stuff, that is big C calories. So if you think about your granola bar having, I don't know, 200 calories in it, we're talking about kilocalories actually. And the food marketing, I thought kilocalories probably sounded scary, so they just switched it to a big C. But those are exactly the same thing. And it takes around 2,000 to 2,500 kilocalories or big C calories for you to, keep your body alive and do what you want to do. You always are requiring energy even when you're sleeping. And the more you do, the more energy you burn. I don't think that that's a news flash to anyone. So the stages of cellular respiration, we're going to go through these ones slowly. I'm going to try and summarize them onto a piece of paper that you were given. So this was in your package, or you could print it out. It gives us a place that we're going to work on a key for this that summarizes our notes into maybe just a few words, and hopefully brings together a story of the 3 stages of glycolysis, because it should be a logical sort of narrative or story that moves from glucose to ATP and includes all the other components in that chemical reaction. So we want to account for the oxygen, we want to account for the carbon dioxide, we want to account for the water. And so we're going to talk about glycolysis as the first, the citric acid cycle, or you could call it the Krebs cycle, as the second stage of glycolysis. And the third stage of glycolysis is oxidative phosphorylation. Find a plant you can name that. If you have a new kitten, consider naming them oxidative phosphorylation. Use that word in as many ways as you can. It is a massive word. But really what oxidative phosphorylation is 2 different parts. So it's the electron transport chain, and the process of chemiosmosis. And oftentimes, by the time we get to the end of cellular respiration, we get tired with the amount of details. But chemiosmosis is the major payday when it talks about making ATP. So don't get tired by the end of this. I'll divide the video up into 2 parts to kind of recharge you with a break. But ATP, there's a massive amount of ATP produced in this final part of oxidative phosphorylation. See how many times I've used that word? So chemiosmosis is really important, and sometimes it gets left off of students' summary of cellular respiration. So let's kick this off and start about glycolysis. So glycolysis is the first stage of cellular respiration. It's going to happen in the cytoplasm of the cell. We've talked about the mitochondria being, the energy or the energy producer or the powerhouse, the mighty mitochondria. But as we start talking about glycolysis, we're actually talking about glycolysis happening in the cytoplasm. And glycolysis can happen without oxygen. And so it can happen when there is no oxygen present. What it's going to do is start with glucose, and we know that glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, and ultimately break that 6-carbon molecule into 2 3-carbon molecules. And so we've got, this accounting for the things going in and the things going out. We haven't created or destroyed carbon molecules. And the 3-carbon molecule is called pyruvate. So I'm going to draw this out because it also produces some ATP. Remember, that is the name of the game. That's ultimately the energy that we were supposed to be talking about. And then in your textbook and in my story of all this, it's also going to produce some of these. So nicotinamide dihydride, I think, is NADH, if I remember that right from my biochemistry courses. Probably should have looked that up before I started talking about this. But what these are energy intermediates. They also carry electrons. And whether you think of them as energy intermediates, so they're not ATP, but they're kind of like ATP because they are required for making a lot of ATP molecules, or you think of them as electron carriers, they're going to be used in a later stage. So they're going to get used in the electron transport chain. And so we need those to be produced in the earlier stages so they can be used up in the later stages. And like I said, that last stage is the major payday for ATP production. So I'm going to come back to this also at the bottom. We're going to switch slides, and I'm going to suggest drawing this stage out. So just to simplify it, if you are a picture person, and sometimes drawing your own picture can be useful, we're going to start out with a 6-carbon molecule, and this is glucose. So we've got 6 carbons there as our starting point. And the main point of glycolysis is it's going to break it apart into 2 3-carbon molecules. And these are called pyruvate, or sometimes pyruvic acid. Either names. It's kind of like, the carboxylic acid or the carboxyl group as a functional group. It's just a naming system difference. So this is the basis of glycolysis. Now, the other thing that it does is that it's going to produce ATP. But if you remember how all chemical processes had a buy-in, they had you had to spend some money to make some money, it's going to take 2 ATP to drive this process, and it actually results in 4 ATP being produced. So we're going to talk about this as being 2 net ATP molecules, right? That's the payout. 2 net. So 2 go in and 4 come out, but we're only really up $2, right? If you spend $2 to make 4, you're only profiting 2. So that's 2 net ATP out of this. Now, the other thing that it does is it produces this NADH. And there's a lot more going on with this, but we're going to remember those as needed for later. And a lot of the times people are pretty intimidated by the name of it. As I said, I forgot to look it up before I started talking. Or I think it's more useful to talk about them as energy intermediates. Right? Because they're intermediate to the process. Or we could talk about them as electron carriers. All right. So that is basically the overall process of glycolysis simplified. Now, at the bottom of the last slide there, I'm just going to scroll so you can see it. After glycolysis, the pyruvate is actually changed into something else. And so this is the end of glycolysis. And if you were reading your textbook, the next stage of cellular respiration is the Krebs cycle. And it says that the Krebs cycle starts with acetyl-CoA. Well, wait a minute, we just talked about how the first step makes this pyruvate molecule. So what's going on in between? This is neither glycolysis nor the Krebs cycle, but it is an important step, is that the pyruvate is turned into a 2-carbon molecule, and it's acetyl-CoA. And so I just shorten or simplify the chemical structure by drawing it that way. We'd actually make 2 of those. And if you take a look at the number of carbon molecules, this step, like I said, it's not glycolysis, it's not the Krebs cycle, it requires oxygen. So oxygen comes in because what we need to account for here is the number of carbon molecules. Over here in pyruvate, there's 3, but acetyl-CoA only has 2. And so when this 1 carbon combines with oxygen, you actually make some carbon dioxide. And this is the first little bit that we're starting to account for all of the components in our chemical reaction. So glucose was a reactant, and oxygen was a reactant. Carbon dioxide was one of the products. And on top of that, the stuff that you don't see in that overall chemical reaction are these intermediate things. So the process of glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. And up until that line, it can happen without oxygen. And this process of making acetyl-CoA is really just getting ready for the next process, the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. All right, so one other way of simplifying this stuff. So we talked about it in words on the last slide. I drew a picture of it, but let's try and get this down to just a few words. So the first stage of respiration is glycolysis, and you can fill out your chart like this. So glycolysis. Remembering lysis for breaking down, glyco for glucose, so it's breaking down glucose, quite literally. It happens in the cytoplasm. Does it need oxygen? No oxygen required. Or you could just say nope. What goes into this stage? So it's going to need glucose, and it's going to need some, not oxygen, ATP, right? So it needs 2 ATP. Well, what comes out of it is 4 ATP. And remember I said that's 2 net ATP, right? That's what we get ultimately out of this one, because that's one of the things that we're trying to account for in the process of cellular respiration. So the other thing is that the glucose becomes pyruvate, or pyruvic acid if you like that naming. The other thing that comes out of it, and I said that this is easy to gloss over, are the electron carriers. And so NADH, if you like that, or you can choose electron carrier or energy intermediate. And remember, I said that those are needed for later. And so it's easy to kind of gloss over them, but they really are required for later. So I'm going to take a break in this, our first part, and then I'm going to come back and we'll do the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation in the next video.